Hi, I'm Nate Zarnota with Baltimore Dog Works and the Urban Gun Dog. I'm going to start this video series on force fetch with kind of going over a bunch of prerequisites that we have before we can even get started on the work. I did a presentation for our local Untitled Chapter this past weekend, gave them a handout, and I figured it would be really helpful to have some visual aids to go along with that. So I'm going to do a video series of the entire process. This is the first video in that series. So let's talk about equipment that you're going to need to do this first. You're going to need some kind of collar for your dog. I do all my obedience, including my force fetch training, with a chain collar, like a choke chain. I would recommend you use that, or a flat buckle collar with a metal buckle. We'll talk about why that's important later. But that's what I would use for a collar. In terms of a leash, you're going to need, a 4 to 6 foot leash. We're going to keep our dog on leash throughout this entire process. It's just helpful to prevent them from being able to do things other than what we want them to do. So it's a really good management tool while we're teaching them the appropriate behavior that we're looking for. You're going to want a check cord as well, so that's a leash as well, just 15 to 30 feet long. We're going to use this towards the end of our force fetch process, when we want to extend the distance away that we're asking the dog to move to retrieve an object for us. You're going to use a dowel to start this process, so something like this. Now this is the centerpiece of these adjustable weight dumbbells, so these screw onto the ends of this dowel, so I can use those over time. I like using a dowel because two things. First, if the dog messes with this too much, like they're getting chewy on it, eventually it's going to slide out of their mouth and fall. And so that helps address not having a stable grip right off the bat. The other thing though is I want to use an object that is not an item that I'm really going to be asking the dog to retrieve after we go through the process of teaching the force fetch. And the reason for that is in case I make some mistakes or I overpressure the dog in certain places, any sort of like bad feelings towards this process the dog is going to have in those cases, it will be associated with this object that I'm never really going to ask him to retrieve again. So it's just a little bit of a safeguard for new folks. So if it's your first time going through this, it's going to give you a little bit more leeway if you make mistakes. That's not an excuse to not pay attention to what you're doing and be very thoughtful as you go through this process, but it's just, I want to stack the deck in my favor for sure. So I like a wooden dowel. That's what we're going to start with in this process. Your other option would be to use some sort of like obedience dumbbell. These are 2 sizes, just different ones. Again, something that I'm not likely to ask my dog to retrieve a whole bunch after we're done with the teaching process. A third option you can use for some dogs is this is a paint roller. So it's light. It's most dogs don't mind holding this. It's not heavy. It feels comfortable in their mouth. So if we're just trying to kind of make the teaching process really easy for them, this is a good one. Things that we're definitely not going to use for our teaching part of this process, we're not using bumpers. I'm going to do a lot of retrieving drills with bumpers later. I'm not going to use these for the initial teaching process though. I want my dog to have a really good attitude. I want them to enjoy picking these up, basically see them as a reward. And so I'm not going to use these during the pressure conditioning or the force conditioning phases of this exercise. Definitely would not use any game either, right? Game animals, ducks, chucker, pigeons, anything like that. I'm not going to use early on in this process. At the end, after we finish, then we'll use a bunch of different stuff. But you're going to use whatever object you're selecting to teach this process. You're going to use it for the entire duration of the training phase of this process, and then we're going to use a bunch of different objects. Anything that we're actually going to ask the dog to retrieve, we'll do those at the end after the dog has a good conceptual understanding of what we're asking. Since I'm doing this mostly geared towards hunting dog folks, a thing that a lot of people think they need is to build a training table like the one I'm sitting on right now. I don't think that's necessary. Well, it's not necessary, but I'll tell you some advantages of it. The first is it makes it so that you don't have to bend over. So if you have back problems or you're teaching a lot of dogs, you're bending over all the time. So picking the dog up allows you to stand up straight. So that's the first thing that is really helpful. The second thing is it kind of limits where the dog can go right off the bat, even if I'm not connecting them to like a cable that runs across the top or tying them off to the side so they really can't move at all. Even if I don't do that, just having them on an elevated surface often helps them just be a little bit more controlled. But the last reason is kind of what I just alluded to is, you know, you can hook the dog's collar to one of these posts really short and kind of hold them in place. And that's really helpful if you have a dog that you're having to fight with a lot with the initial mouth placements that we're going to talk about later. That said, I'm kind of the opinion that your dog should have a decent amount of obedience training before you start this work. Through obedience training, they're going to have learned in a lot of other way less stressful environments or tasks, I guess is a better way to say it. They're going to have learned how to cope with pressure being applied to them and have already have some kind of understanding that they can affect change in their environment by responding appropriately to pressure. So I think that's a really important prerequisite for this exercise, and then that gets you out of having to like tie the dog off to something to immobilize them. That brings me to the last thing that I guess it's technically optional, but for anybody that I'm working with, certainly for my own dogs, them having at least one really solid stationary behavior is a prerequisite for this work. So whether that's a sit or hup or a stand, whoa, I want them to have a really solid stationary behavior, meaning I can give them that command, sit or whoa, and they will hold that behavior. That way, when I start working on placing objects in their mouth and they're wanting to whip their head around and fuss and fight and get away from me while I'm trying to do that, I can enforce that stationary behavior. So I might correct them with the leash and collar, sit, make them hold that sit and remind them that they have an obligation to hold that stationary behavior. And what that does is it lends context to what I'm doing. What I'm kind of explaining to them is this thing I'm placing in your mouth is just another distraction that we're using to challenge your sit stay or your stand stay, your whoa. And so if you have that stationary behavior pretty reliable before you start this exercise, it gives you a way to put some indirect pressure on this behavior. What I mean by indirect pressure is I put force on a behavior, on one behavior, and it improves the dog's performance on another behavior. So in this case, I would be putting pressure on the sit or the stand, and then that would get the dog to more readily accept the mouth placements of the dowel that I'm going to do later. So I do feel like it's really important that you've done some other obedience training to, I don't even think it's a high level, but it seems to be for a lot of folks. I want them to have a solid stay, sit stay, stand stay, hup, whoa, whatever you want to call it, but I want them to have those pieces. When we're working on this exercise, we're going to basically break the trained retrieve or the force fetch down into 3 components. The first is the fetch. That's the process of the dog moving away from me to grab the object. So that is, to me, technically where the fetch ends. The second piece is the hold and carry. So that's the dog, I'm placing the object in their mouth, they're hanging on to that object, and then eventually I can get them to move around and hold on to it reliably while they're moving. And then the third piece is to put those two together. So we have the dog going out to grab the object, and then they're coming back to me with the object. The presentation at the end, whether you want the dog to return to heel position or you want them to sit in front of you, we can do all of that stuff at the end of the process, but that's when we're putting together the fetch and the hold and carry. Once again, we're using one object throughout the entire process. And then when we do apply force in this process, I use the ear pinch. I use the ear pinch because it gives me better control of the dog's head. I'm holding their collar and their ear so I can kind of direct where their head goes. I can move them by holding onto their collar if I need to towards the retrieving object, towards my dowel. The other thing is my background, I didn't start training hunting dogs. I got into them when I got my own hunting dogs and started training with their breed clubs and with NAVDA. So my experience force fetching dogs prior to that was teaching it as an obedience behavior, and often I was using it as a tool when I was resolving aggression issues. So dogs that want to use their mouth inappropriately, I would teach them the trained retrieve so that I have a way that I can teach them. I can control your mouth and where you put it and how you use it. And I found that that's a very effective way to get dogs to think differently about how they use their mouth. It also gives me a safety buffer when I'm doing things that stress a dog out that has a bite history. So for instance, if I make the dog fetch and hold an object and then I need to cut their nails, and that's been a thing that they've been willing to fight me over in the past, then I kind of get this, I'll see them start to let go of this object before they're potentially going to use their mouth in an inappropriate way on me. We've used this for a number of dogs that are reactive towards things out on walks. So with the trained retrieve, we're kind of making them hang on to this. It gives them a job, something they have to focus on doing that we can hold them accountable for. And so for dogs that more of the basic obedience kind of just wasn't enough, teaching them the trained retrieve seemed to be the kind of final thing that really helped them understand, like, I have better things to do than be so outwardly focused on everything that's going on around me and overreactive to those things. So the ear pinch, again, going back to the reason why I said all that stuff, the ear pinch allows me to control the head. And so if I'm concerned about what the dog is going to do with their mouth, then I really want to be able to control their head. And that's why I prefer to use the ear pinch. And that's what we're going to kind of present in this video series. So that's all the prerequisite stuff that we need to talk about for this process. We will talk about layering e-collar over this process at the end. But everything we're going to do right now is with manual kind of intervention, right? So hands-on stuff with the dog, and that's how we're going to teach this process through this video series.